Achtung. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland. And James, we've a very special guest today, and this is I've been looking forward to this since it went in the diary. So put everyone out of their misery and tell us who we've got.
Yeah, you and me the same. A very, very special guest. This is Professor Tami Davis Biddle. And Tami and I go back a little way, actually. I was introduced to Tami, I think, through Anthony Beaver and Seb Cox. Seb, obviously, big friend of the show. And she is professor at the US Army War College alongside another friend of the show, Mike Nyberg. And she's just a brilliant academic and historian on the air war, and her book Rhetoric and Reality in Air Warfare, which came out best part of 20 years ago, is a sort of Bible for anyone who's studying the Strategic Air Campaign, and has been referred to me, endlessly when I was doing War in the West and Big Week and just about anything I've ever come to talk about the Second World War. So, Tami, I'm absolutely thrilled that you've come on, but you suggested a number of different topics, all of which Al and I lapped up. But we've gone to start off with, I hope you'll come back and talk about other things at a different time. But to kick off with, we thought we'd go for that really thorny but one subject that requires a huge amount of nuance but often doesn't get it. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you, James, for that lovely introduction. And I'm delighted to be here. And yes, heaven knows it's a thorny issue. We all think we know about Dresden, even those of us who have studied it as part of the larger air campaign of the Second World War. But it's a very challenging topic. And for years, I just collected documents and I read everything I could find and saved everything I could find. So when I wasn't teaching, I could go back to my documents and try to figure out what was really going on and what led us to that point, us being the Anglo-Americans and the combined bomber offensive. And the last sort of great spasm of bombing activity at the very end of the war in February of 1945, which I sometimes characterize as maybe the darkest month of the darkest year of the very dark early 20th century.
There's not much joy in February 1945, is there?
Not much, no. And it's a time of great fear and anxiety. And even though, as we look back on the war, we can see that it's close to the end, quite close to the end. Yeah. I think the folks who are living through it and living forward in time were not necessarily sleeping all that well, not only because they were being bombed in Britain, but also because they were worried about what might be coming next. So what we have is a situation where the Anglo-Americans are also very fearful of the Russians stalling in their offensive, which has just started in January. So January 12th, roughly, the Russian offensive had finally moved forward and was heading to Berlin and into Germany. And I think the Americans and the Brits were very worried that might be slow going, bogged down, and that if it did, and the Germans managed to hold a defensive position, the war could really extend into the summer and perhaps into the fall in Europe. And that was an immensely daunting prospect. The British were war-weary. They had been pummeled for 5.5 years, and the Americans had another whole war to fight and finish in Japan. And we were really gearing up at that point for what would be later in the year attacks. Well, first with obviously the atomic bomb, although we're not sure that's going to work quite yet, but it's in the testing phases, and we're moving towards something that's going to be very dramatic. But we're also, because we don't know if that will end the war, we're also planning on large-scale invasions of the Japanese home islands. And so that part of the war is very, very busy at this point. So there's just, it's an incredible moment. And of course, right in February in the Pacific, the American Marines were attacking Iwo Jima in order to win an island that could be basically a runway for B-29s that might get in trouble as they made their way up from the Marianas all the way up to Japan, because that was the planned bombing campaign that would start It had started in the fall of 44, but then it would take an even more dramatic turn under Curtis LeMay, starting in March of 1945. So this is just in general a very difficult time in the war. So we're hoping that the Russians are going to move forward. And we start to think, worrying about the fact that the Germans might stall and the fact that we had pretty much run out of men. And here I mean riflemen, trigger pullers,
Yes.
infantry. The Brits were running out of men. We had pretty much run out of men. We were pouring men into the infantry as fast as we could from other places. We were even moving them from the Air Force at that point. But there was a real fear that we just didn't have enough men. So the only way that we could really aid the Russian offensive and help it move westward in a timely way would be to use aircraft and long-range bombers in particular. And so the Air Staff suggested to the Joint Intelligence Committee that they look at the prospect of using aircraft, or what kind of effect would strategic bombers have basically on German cities in the eastern part of Germany. And the idea was that as the Russians were moving westward, the Germans were trying to move eastward to block that movement and to create a firm defense. But basically, what you had to do, what the Germans had to do, was to get people and supplies and men up to that front. And in order to do that, they had to go through several checkpoints, and those were communication centers located in a line of cities to the west of Breslau. And they included Berlin and Leipzig, Chemnitz, and Dresden. And so the Joint Intelligence Committee on the 25th of January, 1945, and this is still very much in the wake of the Battle of the Bulge, the German defenses are underway, the Russian offensive heading west is underway. The JIC looked at the situation and said, in fact, we could use strategic bombers to cause chaos, basically behind German lines, and make it very difficult for the Germans to move men and materiel up to the Russian front. And by attacking cities Berlin was the one that they listed on the 25th, but other cities would soon be added by Bottomley and Harris and Portal. But by attacking a city like Berlin, what they said, and I'll use the exact language because it's quite daunting, they say, a heavy flow of refugees from Berlin in the depth of winter, coinciding with the trekking westwards of a population fleeing from eastern Germany, would be bound to create great confusion, interfere with the orderly movement of troops to the front, and hamper the German military and administrative machine. I find that extraordinary language. On the one hand, it's just sort of a statement of what was happening in the war at that moment and how you might be able to cause more headaches and problems for the Germans. And on that level, it makes perfect sense. And it
There's not a lot of humanity there, is there?
But there's not a lot of humanity there. I mean, it's actually very striking because what you're seeing now is the gloves are completely coming off.
Well,
Right.
given at the start of the war, you've British cabinet members who don't want to destroy German private property with the strategic bombing campaign.
And let's drop leaflets instead.
Let's drop leaflets instead. In 5.5 years, you've gone from that basically to annihilation as a strategy. It's very shocking, isn't it?
Well, I was going to say, what I also find quite shocking is that 4 days before that, the U.S. Strategic Air Force's intelligence office are arguing that the Anglo-American armies have lost the initiative in the West. I mean, really? Have they? I mean, I don't think they have at all. But that's amazing that they're even talking that and saying that the Luftwaffe has been able to rebound to a degree not considered possible by Allied intelligence some 8 months ago. I mean, okay, yes, you got ME-262s hurtling around and stuff, but isn't that just that we've got? I don't know, we sort of got used to kind of being totally top dog and used to completely controlling the skies, and now there's a kind of handful of jets hurtling about. But I mean, that's quite a long way off from losing the initiative, isn't it?
I think, I mean, I've studied this and I've been so perplexed and so intrigued by it. And I'm very interested in escalation in war and what causes escalation and human fear in war. And I think in January of 1945, the Anglo-Americans are deeply rattled. They are not really themselves. And it's really a series of shocks that have hit them, starting, after the great high moment of Falaise and then the liberation of Paris. And it looked like everything was in the bag by September, and we had Hitler on the run. And then suddenly things start to really unravel. Not only sort of a few days after D-Day, we start to see the first V1s landing in Britain. But then we have, as you mentioned, Messerschmitt 262s, which are going twice as fast as any aircraft we've got. The prospect of Schnorkel submarines. Then Arnhem fails, and that was the attempt to really overrun the V launch sites. And then, things are sort of not going very well. Bing, 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 bing. And it's a series of assaults. And then, of course, the culmination is the Battle of the Bulge. And I think with that...
sorry, Tami, and I guess that's also... Sorry to interrupt, but that's also on the back of, horrors like the Hürtgen Forest, which has just turned into this meat grinder that everyone knows about, and they're losing horrible, horrific numbers of casualties, and everyone's just thinking, God, and it's sort of exacerbated by the mud, the cold, the snow, the monochrome landscape. Here we are in January. I don't know what it's like in Washington, but out here I've got kind of monochrome skies. It just feels like today's never really properly got light. You're not feeling full of kind of beans and kind of joys of the spring or anything. So and I guess all that is a sort of human response, isn't it? And I guess what you're saying is all of that is adding to the mix, and hovering in the background is this even worse potential horror story, which is the invasion of the Japanese home islands, which is going to happen almost certainly at this point. And that's, Al and I have talked about this at great length, and we're both very much on the same peg as this, is that actually the fear of and the prospect of having to invade Japan is infiltrating literally every decision that's being made in Europe from kind of, January onwards to the end of the war.
Oh, I think that's right, James. And as you know, just how much we invested in the war in Japan and the logistics lines and the number of men who were poured into that war. And that's part of the reason why we don't have enough men to fight in Europe. But right. Yes, for the Americans, Japan is overshadowing almost everything. But I do think as well, it is this sequential series of new weapons that are arriving. So first it's the V1s, and then just as people are declaring that the V weapons campaign has ended, and Duncan Sands makes a big announcement on the 7th of September, spectacularly badly timed because the V2s start landing the very next day. So just as the newspapers are printing that the campaign is over, the V2s start landing. And I think it just it's a sort of nervous breakdown that's occurring in the Allied High Command to a certain extent. And they do say things like, we've lost the initiative. Well, the Americans the Army Air Forces had come under a pretty serious, for them, attack on their airfields on the 1st of January. And I think, again, this was what was making them think they'd lost the initiative. How could we be back? How after
everything we've done,
everything we've won, and everything we've achieved, how could we possibly, how could this be happening? It can't be happening. And so there's denial going on there, and the fear is exaggerated. You're exactly right. To say that, have they sort of slightly come unhinged a little bit? I think in a way perhaps they have, because they just can't countenance the idea that Hitler is really back on the offensive. And they should have, and the official historians, Webster and Franklin, which of course wrote such brilliant books, but they said, the Allies should have seen this situation much more clearly than they did. And they should not have been in it sort of increasingly going back into a defensive frame of mind. But they were unnerved. They were in an increasingly defensive frame of mind because of what they'd seen. and what they'd experienced in the last few months, and particularly the last few weeks.
And I suppose one has to remember also is that the vast majority of the Allied High Command, instinctively humane people, think of. I mean, I've mentioned this point a number of times, but about the fact that high level commanders are falling out, and it's often sort of argued that that's sort of Anglophobia or Americophobia or whatever. And I never really kind of see it like that. I see it more as these are people who care very, very deeply about the decisions that are being made, don't want to be sacrificing men needlessly.
Yeah.
Feel that burden of responsibility to men's lives. That's in kind of let's say you're arguing over kind of, I don't know, the planning for, the invasion of Sicily or something. That's 1943. By 1945, just think how much that level of responsibility has accelerated and exacerbated and built up. And how long, someone like Eisenhower, Eisenhower's been Supreme Allied Commander in some guise since February 1943. And he's been Allied offensive commander for Torch since, the summer of 1942. So that burden of responsibility has fallen on his shoulders, and he's worn it and borne it manfully all those times. Just think about all those decisions that he has to make, and just think about that weight of responsibility. And then that filters down as well, doesn't it? Sorry, Al.
Well, and then it's the First World War as well, because after all, the Germans they're unable to achieve in a fortnight. In 1940, aren't they? In 2 weeks, they achieve what they can't achieve in the First World War, conquer France, and knock Britain and France out of the war. At this point, 6 years in, the British have only just got to the German border, have only just managed to reset to basically where they got to at the end of the First World War, haven't they? So they're thinking it's another stalemate. We're now where we got to in 1918. Or is it 1917 again? And now that there are technological breakthroughs, are we not apace with the technology? Because after all, the strategic bomber offensive relies on air superiority, and if there's suddenly a fighter that completely negates that, which is what the 262 appears to be,
yes,
that whole house of cards falls in on itself, doesn't it? One of your main weapons. That's, after all, the Allied strategy of using technology rather than people. And if you're short of people, it's basically all their prognostications and predictions are look like they're coming undone.
That's right, Al. I agree with that completely. And of course, the British in particular, and also the Americans, had been worrying about German secret weapons really since the 20s and the 30s. Yeah. Germany was a powerhouse of scientific discovery and academic work in that era. Everyone who wanted to study chemistry and engineering and nuclear physics, that they would go to Germany. So there was a sense that what's behind those closed doors and what might come flying out of Pandora's box next. And I think after seeing a series of weapons, I think people are anticipating more of them. British intelligence was saying there might be an even larger rocket. There was concern about the Germans launching V-1s from submarines off the U.S. coast, of perhaps using some sort of floating ship to launch V-1s towards the U.S. Churchill had to be reassured a number of times in March that there wouldn't be a sort of massive German great last Gotterdammerung suicide attack against Britain. That he was concerned about the use of chemical weapons and biological weapons in a last death throw by the Germans. So nobody knew really what was coming. And I think, and also, this isn't just really starting in late 44. This is all through 43. The British had been told by their intelligence and scientific staffs that large rockets could start dropping on this country at any moment. Yeah. That was in April of 43. And Churchill had been living with that. And they were gathering intelligence and trying to find out what was going on behind closed doors. And of course, Peenemünde was attacked successfully, quite successfully, in August of 43. And that probably bought 2 months of time. God, what a critical 2 months of time it was as well. Because it might have meant that the V2s would have been ready prior to D-Day. So I think they were exhausted. These are exhausted people who are kind of living on fumes by 1945 and are trying to hold it together.
There's unquestionably a sense of sort of anger, of sort of cold-blooded anger that is creeping into, because you rightly point out it's not just Dresden that's being hit at this time. There's others, there's Pforzheim and Würzburg, and this period are getting kind of absolutely hammered as well. Does seem to be this sort of anger that the war is still going on, that these lives are being pointlessly destroyed. Just throw in the towel, and we'll stop bombing. It's a really, really simple equation. And yet, obviously, that doesn't happen. I mean, I've got to say, I think your arguments are really persuasive. They're very powerful, very persuasive, and every so often on this podcast, we have these moments where you're just suddenly thinking, wow, I haven't really properly paused and stopped and thought about it in this way. And I suppose, when you think about a V2, we all sort of go, ha, 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 well, more people were killed making them than actually were destroyed by, were killed by the warhead. Yeah, let's not forget that this is a warhead that is supersonic, that is the first ever man-made object to go into outer space.
Yes,
that's quite a thing. And if you've got the technology to do that, yes, then presumably it's not that far removed from then improving the accuracy a little bit.
Well, or whatever else might be up their sleeve next, because after all, the Allies know what they've got up their sleeve, haven't they?
Yes.
They know that they've developed, an atomic bomb that. After all, they've been keeping proximity fuses secret that entire time themselves for fear the Germans, that they're engaged in this technology cat and mouse themselves anyway. And like you say, Jim, a rocket touches space, suddenly appearing on the scene feels like you've been beaten, doesn't it? In some respect. I mean, it's interesting, Tami, that you say, before say Market Garden, there is this sort of victory fever and a febrile. Do you think that's born of them running on fumes? I think finally we've won, thank God. With the ends in sight, we don't have to bear this responsibility anymore. And so because after all, the victory of Falaise and out of Overlord is an extraordinary victory for the Allies. It
is. Oh my gosh,
roughly
yes.
goes according to plan. It's the liberation of Paris is ahead of schedule. All that you can forgive them for feeling that they've just about done everything they need to do. There's been an assassination attempt on Hitler after all, which must feed into the feeling that the Germans are about to fall in on themselves. And obviously since the start of the war, the British assessment has been, all we've really got to do is apply enough pressure and the Nazi regime will fall in on itself, because look, after all, it's full of it's gangsters and weirdos and extremists. So it's not got any, they're not like us, so they'll fall in on themselves.
Yes.
And so do you think that that victory fever in late summer, early autumn is a product of the same atmosphere of tension and responsibility, that they're reaching so much for victory at that point, and then because it's like a pendulum, and then it swings completely in the other direction.
It does. It is a pendulum, and it's always swinging, usually a little bit too far in either direction. But I do think, Al, that I agree with your thesis. I think there's a lot of that going on, and of course, if you just think about 1944 and trying to get ready for the Normandy invasion, trying to scrounge up enough landing craft, trying to get air superiority. And of course, James, you've written about this with Big Week, and we had to have superiority over the Luftwaffe. You can't do an amphibious landing of that scale and have a hope of it succeeding if you don't have air superiority. Otherwise, it could be a really bloody affair, or it could fail outright. And we don't have it yet, not really. So we have to just hammer away. And it's this incredible battle that takes place in 1944 in the skies over Germany. It's like a Passchendaele of the sky. And it's got to be incredibly nerve-wracking for all involved. Heaven knows. I mean, Hap Arnold had 4 heart attacks in the course of the Second World War. And then, you get on and it's all right, and we land and we're there and we've secured the beachhead, but then we have to battle our way out. It's much slower than we expected. And then so when we finally do break out, I think there's this incredible joy and incredible sense of relief. And I do think it is, from people who were just barely breathing very shallowly for a very long time. And finally thinking, oh my gosh, I can actually pull some air into my lungs and think that this thing might actually end fairly soon. And then for the Americans, then we'll get on to the next one, which is going to be even worse. So yeah, I think there's a lot to do with that. I also think, to come back to a point that you made, Al, earlier, I think that the shift away from, not wanting to harm any German private property, a bit like, not wanting to destroy the private property of the Coca-Cola company in Dr. Strangelove, but not from that far extreme all the way to Dresden. It's a very incremental set of steps. Each year, you're taking a little step further from where you start. And so when you finally get to 1945, it's a huge distance, but it doesn't seem that way because you've done it so incrementally that I think you've just been thinking about whatever the last steps were. And, the last steps were because of the weather in Northern Europe. For the Americans, they have to really kind of abandon their dream of precision bombing. That has to go in quotation marks, but precision bombing of industrial sites, because they just can't keep a tempo up enough to have the bombing be worthwhile. They've got to go to essentially blind bombing too. And the Brits, of course, had done that a long time ago, but had become really good at it. And were actually, and this is sort of a shocking statement for lots of people, but the Brits, most of the time, because most of the time it was really cloudy in Europe, shocking to know, but most of the time the Brits were actually more accurate than the Americans with strategic bombing, even though we did try very hard to use our bomb sites. And every time there was decent weather, that's where we defaulted, whereas Harris was defaulting to area raids. But because of the circumstances and because of the weather, we were basically doing a kind of modified area bombing as well. We were aiming for marshalling yards, but these were big, inaccurate raids because we weren't great on instrument. We didn't train on it the way the Brits did. And so we were hitting a lot of stuff down below. And so it was probably, if you were a German civilian, sometimes hard to tell if you were being attacked by the Brits or the Americans. But essentially, I think the story is that we had really kind of been taking the gloves off very slowly for several years. And then so when they finally came off, and to go back to that language I read about refugees, I think it just didn't sound shocking in the way that it might have done in 1941 or 1942. To make that kind of a statement, red lights would have gone off and red flags would have gone up, and people would have said, oh my God, that's crazy. But in 1945, under the circumstances that we've just discussed, and for all the reasons that you've laid out, Alan and James, and I've tried to put forward, I don't think that people were, and I think also there's a brutalizing effect that comes with long total war.
Also, Tami, the other day, Al and I were at the RAF Museum in Hendon, and we were shown the Blue Book, which had all
Harris's famous Blue Books,
and all the photographs. And how can you not become inured to that by looking at that every single day? I don't want to speak for you, Al, but I know these cities were bombed. I know what numbers, I know the tonnage of bombs that were dropped on Germany by just RF Bomber Command alone, all the rest of it. But when you look at those Blue Book and you look at those one photograph after another, and you look at the absolute carnage, the unbelievable scale of destruction, that is a draw-in breath, gobsmacking moment. But if you're looking at that every single day, inevitably you're going to become dehumanized to that. And it's just another target, it's just another place, it's just another marshalling yard, it's just another bit of industrial build-up that you've got to get rid of. And okay, so lots of houses get hit, and you're sorry about that, but you didn't start the war, and if they stop the war, then we'll stop the bombing. And you can see how that comes. But because one of the arguments about in recent years, a number of people have said, have pointed out that Dresden was pretty Nazi. Yes, it did have Zeiss Icon and lots of other industry as well. And I know you kind of argued, Tammy, that that's a little bit of a red herring, and I don't disagree at all. But one of the arguments is so Dresden is a reasonable target by the targeting of the day, but the problem is they mark the old part of the town, and it's the absolute old ancient heart of beautiful Dresden. And why did they need to do that? Couldn't they have hit the barracks at the north of the city, or couldn't they have actually focused on the marshalling yard? And yet they don't. But what you're saying is, it's the whole point of the raid is to cause mayhem and hit the center and just wipe out Dresden as a place as a nodal point, effectively, isn't it? Because it's a meeting point. Because it's not just troops passing through Dresden to go to the Eastern Front. It's also troops passing through Dresden to get into Italy, which is still being fought. I mean, Italy's not over till the final offensive is launched in early April. So that's useful for the Italian campaign as well, to get to wipe out Dresden, this crossroads, this centre, this railway network, and this major hub in southeast Germany. Yeah,
no, exactly, James. It's a key nodal point, a communication centre for the war at that point. And I think they're thinking, let's cause more chaos to give the Germans real headaches and make sure that they've got to deal with the refugees who are flowing in from the east. They've got to move the men through and around those refugees. They've got to house the refugees. They've got to, it becomes a chaotic scenario in that communication center. But the ability to sort of not pause and think, well, what does that actually mean? That you're going to now hit the center of the city that is swollen with refugees. And refugees are women, young children, old people. To not stop and say, wait a minute, this is going a bit too far, which of course happens after Dresden, but before Dresden, no one really pauses. And I think, the only way that I can make sense of it is for all the reasons that we've talked about. But I do think it is at that moment seen as this, yes, we'll just attack this key center that is so important for administrative purposes, for transport. There's some industry, but that's sort of off to the side. What really matters is the location of this city, a location of Chemnitz, location of Leipzig, the location of Berlin. These are going to cause problems for the Germans, and they're going to aid the Russians and make sure that the Russians advance. And oh, by the way, this is right on the eve of Yalta. And we're going to prove that we have great, powerful airplanes that can do a great deal of damage. And this is when, huge political questions about the future of Europe are going to be decided. So I don't think that that's completely out of the picture either.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that, Tami, because that's very often an angle people say, is that Dresden, and they say this about the atomic bombs in Japan as well, is it's a way of showing the Russians what the Allies are capable of, is sort of almost firing a shot across their bows strategically. And does it qualify as that, or because that gets said a lot about the atomic bombs, obviously, but it sometimes comes into the picture, and particularly in a lot of the debate in this country, it's a thing to land on Churchill, because people have mixed feelings about Churchill in the discourse here in the UK, and that's one of the sort of accusations is, Dresden was done politically as a stunt to show the Russians, that's the main reason, because there are lots of main reasons for Dresden in the debate that we have here.
Al, this is a tough question, and I wrestle with it a lot. I think if you do a counterfactual, you can take that out of the picture and still get an attack on Dresden. So I think that's not central. I think it's just one more little factor that might be pushing sort of in the same direction, and maybe in the back of Churchill's mind. What he's really wanting is for the war to end, because he's very afraid of what might come out of Germany next.
Yeah.
But he's also aware that he wants to prove to Stalin, that we've been good allies, that in fact, the strategic bombing offensive was a kind of second front.
Yeah.
That we didn't, that in fact, we were spending our resources this way, but it was in fact helping the Russians. taking a burden off of them. They didn't fully recognize it. And so I think part of it was to demonstrate, look, this is something that we've done as part of our part of the war effort. So I think that's going on. But I think there is this, because Churchill says right on literally the day before, or a couple of days before he leaves for Yalta, he goes to Sinclair, who's the Secretary of State for Air, and says, what plans do we have for basting the Germans in their retreat from Breslau? I think that's really mostly about how do we help the Russians and how do we make sure the war ends. Yeah. But I think it might be a little bit about Yalta and the political settlement. And of course, this is weighing hugely on Churchill yet again, because thinking a lot about Poland and the future of Poland. And Britain owes the Poles a great deal. He knows that it's probably going to end fairly tragically, because Stalin's not going to want to not be in control of Poland at the end of the day. And that's going to be tragic for a lot of people who've helped the British in the course of the war.
Other things about, I think it's worth touching on some of the other myths around the Dresden raid. For instance, that it had never been attacked before, which isn't the case, is it? It had been on the receiving end of strategic bombing.
But that was American strategic bombing, so Harris might not have counted it as Harris probably wouldn't have counted it as an attack, because he didn't really think the American raids were anything close to his. And frankly, he was right. But yes, the Americans had hit it on the 7th of October, and they had hit it again as a secondary target on the 16th of January. It had been hit before.
I think that's sorry to interrupt, Tami. I think it's one of the things that I think most people don't appreciate is that increasingly through into 1944, and certainly by 1945, when say the 8th or the 15th Air Force were bombing a main target in somewhere in the Reich, there were also 8 or 9 other targets, because they had so many bombers. 8th Air Force can sort of, send out 1,100, 1,200 bombers in one go, quite regularly. Yeah. And you might send 350 to the main target, and the rest are they're being splintered all over the place, and that's all about decoying and spoof raids, and it's not just about that. It's about overwhelming the German air defenses. Yeah. And if you've got that number of assets, that's a very sensible approach. So quite a lot of targets don't get hit terribly effectively, because they're only hit by 77 B-24s. When I say only 77, compared to kind of the Battle of Britain, that's a huge number. But that's why a lot of these targets are not really hammered in the same way that something like Hamburg or Dresden is. Overall, you've got to look at the kind of the US air strategic bombing campaign in the whole, and look about the total effort rather than focusing so much on individual raids, I think.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. But certainly our sites were trained on the eastern part of Germany, and so prior to the actual Dresden attack and prior to the big attack on Berlin of the 3rd of February, which was a big American raid on the center of a city, which again speaks to the fact that this was a campaign. This wasn't just a one-off against Dresden. The Berlin raid was really a time when we went in and tried to hammer the center of the city, and that was very unusual for us. Even if we were hitting marshalling yards, we were claiming that we were trying to do precision targeting of industrial sites. But this time we said, it's the center of the city. It was the day before Yalta discussions began. And again, I think part of it is to say to Stalin, look, we've been good allies. We want you to cooperate with us, because we really did do some hard work in this war, and in ways that you never fully appreciated with our strategic bomber offensive. But there were a lot of cities being hit by the Americans and by the Brits. I think the Brits had hit Magdeburg prior to Dresden. They were going to hit Chemnitz the day after Dresden. The thing about Dresden is so many contingencies worked in favor of Bomber Command on that night.
It's a perfect storm, isn't it?
Yeah.
It really is. It's absolutely the perfect storm. And lots of people don't realize that the reason Dresden burned is because it was the target marking by the mosquitoes number 5 group, was so precise on the old city. And as you point out, James, it was aimed at the sports plots in the old city to cause as much havoc and chaos in the administrative centers and the communication centers as possible. But it went so well. And even the Chemnitz raid, which the next day had many more thousands of incendiaries dropped on it, it did not become a firestorm because contingencies were just not aligned in the right way. And on the night of the 13th, 14th of February, everything seemed to go right for Bomber Command. And Bomber Command was operating at the very height of its capability. And its capability was, in 1945, exceedingly formidable. Again, we don't often realize how powerful it was and how powerful it was compared to the Americans, but Lancasters carried a lot of tonnage. They could be incredibly accurate. So when Dresden was hit, the sophistication of the raid was mind-blowing. First, they go in with basically blind illuminators to mark the contours of the city first, so that the follow-on precise targeters, the target.
Yes, Tami, what does that mean? The blind marking, what that getting the contours. How does that actually work?
They use H2X, and they go in and just sort of drop phosphorus to outline basically where the city is.
So when you're coming in, you can see it silhouetted.
Silhouetted, yeah.
Amazing.
I mean, this is again mind-boggling stuff, but that's exactly what's happening. And then, that's what the mosquito pilots are seeing. They're seeing, okay, here's Dresden, here's the contour. So us now, as we fly down to literally 500 feet, let's figure out where the center is, where the sports plots is, and they nail it. They just nail it. And so they drop a very big concentration of bright red, again, chemical bombs to sort of mark where the center of the city is. And that means that the subsequent bombers flying over after that can see exactly where they're supposed to drop. It's like a big red bullseye in the city of Dresden. And then you've got, and this is, all been worked out through trial and error throughout the course of the war, but this is 45 and it's all come together. But starting in sort of 43 with what was called the New Haven method, you could even have, in addition to the pathfinders and the target markers, you could have a master bomber who flies in the sky over the target and is constantly communicating with the pilots who are flying in over the city. And he's adjusting them constantly for, where smoke is, and he's making them remark, and so they can remark the target. They can even sky mark when a target has become so obscured by smoke or by cloud. They can mark it literally in the sky with parachute flares that hang up in the upper atmosphere, so that pilots know, even if they can't see a thing on the ground, they know where the target is. So this is the level of sophistication that we're dealing with for Bomber Command in 1945. And because there were many feints flown that night, they were also using mandrel jamming equipment to give difficulty to the Freya and Würzburg German radar. German radar had been largely pushed back onto Germany proper. Whereas in other years of the war, Germany could start picking up British.
That's a big,
such an
very
interesting
important
point. Isn't
yeah,
it?
yeah.
That's such a big
gosh.
point. And what a difference that makes. So that makes it much. That makes it so much safer for Bomber Command. And if it's safer for them, then you've got fewer people attacking, which means you've got fewer bombers being thrown off course and having to kind of sort of rush around trying to avoid night fighters and what have you. So they can just steadfastly head on towards their target. You've got more of them, so more are reaching the target because they're not being shot down or intercepted beforehand. So on and so forth, and that all leads towards those raids being more and more efficient and effective.
Exactly. So this raid, the first wave, which is going to be about 260 Lancasters on Dresden, then there's going to be a second wave coming in at about 1:30 a.m. of roughly 500 Lancasters. But that first wave was critical because those mosquitoes that marked the city did such an effective job because they were not really very harried. So not only has the radar moved back, and also we've gotten mandrel jamming devices that are very effective at that moment in time. There's a constant measure, countermeasure going on with radar.
Yeah.
And at that point, we were kind of ahead. So we were using mandrel very effectively, and so bombers could fly out of the mandrel screen and with impunity up to that moment. And then they would head off in various directions, and some of them would drop window. Window was dropped extensively for both the first and second phases.
Yeah.
And of course, window looks like a bomber attack on a radar screen, on a German radar screen. There were other feints being flown to other cities. There was just the level of extraordinary sophistication and coordination of pulling the Germans away from Dresden on that night was amazing. And of course, most of the flak guns had gone either to the Ruhr or to the Eastern Front. So Dresden was very lightly defended. There were insufficient bombing shelters, although I will say that the Gauleiter of Dresden, Lutschmann, had
he was all right, wasn't
cellars. He was taken care of. He had cellars under his office and under his house. But for the poor souls of Dresden, they were not so well taken care of, and there weren't enough cellars. But the problem is with a firestorm, once the fires got going, and because the marking was tight, all the subsequent bombers dropped in a tight pattern, and that's what started the firestorm. Once you've got a firestorm going, though, firestorm is self-feeding. It pulls all the oxygen in the surrounding area to itself, which means it was pulling oxygen up out of the shelters also, suffocating the people in the shelters, suffocating people not in shelters, just in the city trying to escape. So a firestorm is a thing unto itself. It's a meteorological kind of phenomenon. It's a natural phenomenon based on a huge fire. And so the Germans are just not, that they have so many knocks against them. And then when everything goes right for Bomber Command, it does produce this awful conflagration in this city. And again, as I said, this is not different from other raids Bomber Command had been flying. And the Americans came in the next morning, sort of adding a little bit of salt to the wound, attacking the marshalling yards the next day on the 14th. I think it sort of shocked everyone that when all this came together and worked so perfectly, so much destruction could be wrought from it. And there were only a few times when this had happened. It had happened at Hamburg in July of 1943, which was, again, remarkable. The first time Bomber Command used window, lots of things went right for Bomber Command, and again, about 40,000 people were killed. But it didn't happen all that often because everything did have to go right in terms of the raid itself, in terms of the defenders being pulled away.
The breeze in the air, which is also something that's not to be, that has to be considered, isn't it? The fact that you've got that breeze just sort of fanning the flames and sort of pushing it in a certain direction.
Yeah, clear weather right when the marking was taking place,
right.
So they could come down very low and get to where they wanted to be, and then relatively clear for everyone else coming after, so they could see the bright phosphorus burning red bullseye. So it's just one of those things in war that is so, when it happens, it just becomes breathtaking. And you knew all the capabilities were there if they all came together. And it's sort of in a similar way what happened at Hiroshima. You have this immense bomb and it lands relatively close to where it's supposed to land. And there's no fighter defense. And it has a horrific impact on the civilians below.
But also so does the firebombing, of course, of Tokyo. And, by the B-29s,
yes.
and that's just not on the kind of radar, isn't it? I suppose it's been hidden to a certain extent by the atomic bomb, and it's been hidden by Dresden, I guess.
We have to take a quick break now. We're talking to Tami Davis Biddle. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. James and I are talking to Tami Davis Biddle. Tami, the public debate about Dresden, I think, is one that's fairly well rehearsed. What did the military establishment, what did the air forces learn from these raids, or from this raid in particular? What do they what? Because after all, Churchill pretty quickly starts writing things to cover his backside, basically, doesn't he? They went too far. This isn't what we wanted, all sort of thing. But what feeds into the? Because after all, we've got the Cold War coming, where essentially area bombing is your deterrence. In effect, the atomic bomb is area bombing, at its ne plus ultra, isn't it? It's the purification of area bombing. So is that what the military take from raids like Dresden? That actually this is what we need, or do they recoil?
I think it's mixed, Al. I think partly they're kind of they're not shocked or astonished by their capabilities, but they are wrestling with how do you now think about this? Yeah. How do you think about war? War is now about deterring wars more than it is fighting them. Yeah. But I also do think that they are learning and they're watching, and of course it's Curtis LeMay who moves to the firebombing of Japan in March of 1945, who then, of course, becomes head of Strategic Air Command and oversees Strategic Air Command in the U.S. for the period of its great height in the 50s and 60s. So clearly he has learned about the power of strategic bombing. But I do think also there is a sense that, well, certainly Arnold, who's the head of the U.S. Army Air Forces, is concerned. He writes to Spots right away and says, have we changed our method? Are we behaving like the Brits? And that's a big concern for him because he's working hard to distinguish American bombing from British bombing. So Spots actually gets a great series of questions which he resents because, understandably, he didn't actually change tactics very much. And he said afterwards in his response, and it was actually Anderson responding for him, but I'm sure he was in contact with Spots, but he basically said, look, we were looking for a way to help advance the Russian front, which could not afford to stall. We felt this was a way to do it. We used operational methods that were the ones we always use. So nothing really changed. We've been doing this kind of bombing for a long time, General Arnold, if you've been paying attention. But so I think there was, for certain ones like Arnold, there was a concern that this would look bad for the Americans. I think for Churchill, there was a sense that, oh my God, we may have gone too far. And of course, this ended up being the city that was beautiful, Baroque architecture, the Florence on the Elbe, a place where many sort of cultured and educated Britons had gone for generations to summer, in Dresden, because it was such a beautiful place. And now it's been attacked in what seems to be a rather mechanistic, cruel, thoughtless way. But that's, again, looking back on it, what was driving it forward was the fear and the concern about advancing the Russian front. Not nearly enough thought about what's going to actually happen to the refugees. And that is the puzzle for me. Why did they just not, what kind of cognitive filtering was going on in the minds of those who okayed that directive and built on it and said, yes, we will cause chaos, and yes, we'll use the refugees as a point of leverage. But, it starts to unravel almost immediately because an Air Commodore at SHAEF named Grierson has the rather, I think, unusual and probably not very wise idea to try to explain what was going on with this campaign in the aftermath of Dresden. And he's talking about how they're going to cause chaos in these cities. And of course, reporters are saying, well, doesn't this mean, these cities are swollen with refugees, and you're saying you're exploiting the fact of the refugees being there. Isn't that a kind of terror bombing in a way? And it's picked up by an AP reporter, Howard Cohen, who writes about it. It clears the censors, amazingly. I don't know how, but clears the censors. It gets printed in a newspaper in the US. It's censored in Britain. But it raises a lot of questions. And I think it does signal the fact that when these questions are being wrestled with, that some in the Air Force have started to become uncomfortable, and they are feeling a degree of, oh my God, we should have thought about the fact that this was refugees are human beings, for God's sakes. And I think, frankly, I've seen the transcript of the Grierson press briefing, and Frederick Taylor called it a very woolly language, and I think it is. I think he starts into it, and then he realizes how badly it's going, how badly this is briefing. It's just not sounding good to say that you're going to exploit the refugees in the city. And I think he starts to realize in the middle of the press briefing that this was probably unwise. And then it gets around. It's not as well known in the UK as it is in the US right away, but it starts to sort of work its way into the British consciousness. And so a couple of MPs ask about it, and it just comes up a few times. And this is when Churchill, in late March, says, he really he's looking to not have to suffer responsibility for it. And I think often civilians run away from that kind of responsibility, even though in lots of ways he did a lot to catalyze it. With that statement to Sinclair, what are we doing to base the Germans in their retreat from Breslau? That meant the Prime Minister was interested. That got the attention of Bomber Command of the Air Staff, as of course it should. He's the Commander-in-Chief. He's now saying, I want this done. You will step up and do it. That's how civil-military relations works in a democracy. So Churchill had a big hand in this, and now he's saying, well, I think, the language is... The official historians say it's the least felicitous of the Prime Minister's long series of wartime minutes. And it is, it just makes the air staff kind of roll their eyes and think, oh God, he's running away from responsibility, even though he's the one who put us on to this in lots of ways and who kind of urged us on. He said to Sinclair at the end of the original memo, pray report to me in the morning. That pray report to me is like I think Little Heart said, it was like a jockey taking a whip to a racehorse and saying, tell me what you're going to do. And so now he's backing away. And of course, Churchill as a man is very concerned about his reputation, about how he's going to be seen in history. And, as the brilliant work by David Reynolds lays out to us, he wants to control his own legacy. Yep. So he's starting to try to control his own legacy here. That minute was withdrawn from the record and replaced with something that the air staff could stomach a little bit more easily, because the original minute had words like terror bombing and wanton bombing, and it was over the top, at least in the eyes of the air staff. So I think there was, and frankly, Al and James, I think the fact that it's never sat easily on our Western conscience, and I think that is a good thing. I think that means we have humanity, and that even in the worst situation, and I've described February 45 as the worst situation, that even there we could recognize when we'd gone too far, that we had failed to think about refugees in terms of humanity, that we thought about them in terms of a military lever, a form of obstruction, a way to gain an advantage. But these were human beings, flesh and blood, old people, children, women.
Can you see sort of concerns over? I mean, today there's obviously enormous concerns over collateral damage in any military conflict.
That's exactly what I was
the
going
West
to ask.
Is are the seeds here? Is that where it goes to? I mean, obviously you've got Hiroshima and Nagasaki following, but is Dresden a symbol of that very first thing? Like, hang on a minute, maybe there's another way.
I think probably yes, James. I mean, I don't think how far do you get into any debate or even discussion over strategic bombing in the contemporary world without the word Dresden coming in?
Yeah, not very far.
At about the 2-minute mark, or maybe the 20-second mark. It just jumps right in there. And again, I don't think we're always that well informed about why it happened and how it happened, but we bring it in and we bring it up. And it is this kind of thing that tugs at us. Deep somewhere, some kind of primal tug saying this was where we got it wrong, and we've got to not let that happen again, even though we fully recognize that in war, terrible things are going to happen, that there is going to be collateral damage, that mistakes, to use the sort of universal passive voice, mistakes will be made, steps will be taken. But we know that, and very well aware of the fact that we want to hold the high ground. We want to hold the moral high ground as Brits, as Americans. We don't want to see ourselves in the same category as the enemy, as indiscriminate, as willing to kill innocents. That's what makes us different. That's what makes us worth having victory at the end of the day.
So there's a sense around Dresden that it's that we stoop to their level or something, perhaps.
I think, yes. I think
if you see what I mean.
Yes, I do.
Because after all,
this is where all the nuance comes in.
Well, exactly.
This is
that
the
needs
nuance that we're talking about, and how hard it is to write about this and to talk about it with nuance. I think, again, for the people living that war forward and afraid of all the things that were happening to them and had happened to them, they were brutalized. They became cognitively insensitive. And as James, as you're saying, you look at thousands of pictures of bomb damage, you start to become inured to it. Yeah. So if you're going forward, it sort of looks like the thing that makes sense to do. But then once it turns into what it turned into, which was a firestorm in a beautiful city packed with refugees, you look back on it in a different light. And even if you understand why it happened, you're still unsettled. You're still thinking.
But you have that same unsettlement, don't you? Sort of, looking at the sort of bomb down wreck of, I don't know, Ornay in Normandy, or Villers-Bocage, which is, these are two towns in Normandy that are completely and utterly flattened by a combination of bombing and artillery fire. And, new recruits who've just landed in Normandy and brought up to the line, they go through this and they go, that's pretty bad. And then they go for another town and they sort of go, that's bad. And then they go for a third town and they just go, oh, what the heck? And it's exactly the same when you're going through Italy, this sort of beautiful country that we all love going on holiday in, and it's sort of classical allusions and the Renaissance and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, all those towns around Cassino, for example, Cassino, 100% destroyed, Frosinone, 95% destroyed, et cetera, et cetera. It just goes Pontecorvo, kind of, 90% destroyed. utterly destroyed. Lots of Italians raped by, French colonial troops, and so on and so forth. This sort of typhoon of war and steel just sort of, hurtling up the leg of Italy or across Normandy or into Germany. And I suppose the strategic bombing campaign is just an extension of that on a kind of sort of bigger level and a kind of more destructive level. But everyone's getting inured to it, and you start to see that blurring of the kind of Allied effort and the morality of the crusade, in inverted commas, by kind of sort of middle of 1943 in Europe, don't you?
God knows, there's a lot of bad behavior on so many levels from.
Yes. And this is the point that people like Keith Lowe, who've done kind of important work, and sort of saying not everyone who was in the Second World War was a hero. Some people, they didn't do heroic things, and they actually did some very bad things. And we do need nuance at every level of this, of our understanding of this conflict, I think. And overall, obviously, we're kind of banging the drum for the Allies and the moral crusade and getting rid of Nazism and the Imperial Japanese Empire, etc., etc. But absolutely, it's good to pause and think and not be complacent about our role in the Second World War.
Oh, absolutely. I can't agree more. And as I said, there was a lot of bad behavior. Will Hitchcock's book, Bitter Road to Freedom, talks about some bad behavior by the Allies. The thing about war is that it has a brutalizing effect. It does. And as you were explaining so beautifully with the metaphor about getting from, being shocked by the first town you get to, and by the third or fourth, you're less shocked and less shocked. And then you're in the middle of it, and you're outside the rules of normal civilization. Foreign country, it's a different planet, frankly.
Absolutely. It's a foreign country. It's not just the past, it's a foreign country. It's
war is an alien terrain, and once you've walked it, you don't come all the way back. I don't think you have scars, and you feel it. I used to show my students at Duke University, who were totally innocent of war, completely innocent. I would show them the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan, and I'd turn the lights back on, and they'd all sort of be blinking and in shock, and I'd say to them, what would you do if your arm was cut off by a piece of artillery shell? Would you go back and get it? Because, of course, that scene occurs. There's a man running up onto the beach. He loses his arm due to a piece of artillery shell, cuts it off, and what do you do? I mean, there are no rules for that. There are no rules for that.
There's no training for that either.
In training, anywhere, nowhere do you have. And so things that are happening in war all around you, where there are just no rules, you're outside the bounds of civility, outside moral boundaries that you thought you knew, with the brutalization of so many years and so much fear occurring all the way around. And there's a fear that the Germans will get an atomic bomb. Al, you mentioned that earlier, but we don't know what's behind that curtain. We don't know. And it could be that. There was speculation. There's plenty of it in the press.
Yeah. I mean, in actual fact, of course, they were absolutely nowhere near it, and they'd effectively abandoned it, or any serious approach to doing it in July 1942. But we don't know that, do we? So That's the point. Well, Tami, this has given us so much to think about. This has been crackerjack. It really has. It's been, I should be thinking about this for days after, I can assure you.
It's been my great pleasure.
It's been fantastic.
I love to think hard about these really super hard, difficult, nuanced, troubling questions. I don't know why that is, but that's kind of where I've been for most of my professional life. So and it's a strange thing to have, strategic bombing be such a focus of your internal life. I do fly over cities sometimes in aircraft, and tears roll down my eyes or my cheeks, and I have to tell the person next to me that I've got allergies or something. But I'm just thinking, what was it like to be down there in 1944, 45? Yeah. So it was such a joy to talk to you. It really was.
Well, likewise. Thank you so much for joining us, Tami. It's been an absolute pleasure, and
it really, really has.
Thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you again soon.